online and my dear friends. On behalf of the editors of the volume and Taylor and Francis Group, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you on today's launch. Taylor and Francis, as many of you would know, is one of the world's leading publishers in books, journals, and online resources. Routledge, which is an imprint of the Taylor and Francis Group, began publishing books and journals as early as 1836. And the Routledge India or South Asia program, as we call it, was started around 2005, 2006 with the idea of having a dedicated focus on scholarship emanating from the region or relating to the region. And in the last 15 plus years, we have done an impressive range of books across disciplines, across geographies and subject areas. All books that we do get simultaneously published in all print and digital formats and are made available across the world through the TNF network. And in addition, the books commissioned through the South Asia office also have a territorially priced South Asia edition. The book being launched today is one of our important publications, and we found it very striking when during the course of our discussions that we were having around the volume on at least 2-3 grounds. First, that using archaeological methods and techniques or practices, basically it interrogates the idea of two very contested periods in Indian history, which is early medieval and medieval, and through contrasting voices, which converse with each other, which debate with each other, and which make us rethink the whole idea of early medieval and medieval. And it takes a region which is a very significant but marginalized, a not so adequately represented region, which is the Eastern Ganga-Brahmaputra and the Meghna Basin, basically. Most of this, this accounts for several states in India and Bangladesh now, all sides, and scholars on both sides of the border, along with some scholars of Europe, also have collaborated to do this unique project. But what also struck us was also the range of interconnected areas that it was talking to advance a certain kind of a formulation, which is basically from agrarian development to cropping patterns to landscapes to settlements to potteries to monumental remains. So take a whole range of area to do that. So when the book has been published and is being formally launched, I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the editors of the volume and the contributors to Dr. Swadhin Sen and so Dr. Surpriya Varma here, and I also take this opportunity to fondly remember Dr. Bhairabi Sahu and also celebrate his scholarship, basically. And we have a very distinguished set of panelists here to basically talk about the book that is being launched today. For me, on a personal note, it's like a homecoming. I've had the privilege to work with Professor Romila Thapar, Professor Upinder Singh, and also, Professor B.D. Chattopadhyaya, who this book, in whose honor this book has been done, basically. So it's personally, it's like a homecoming for me. And, but we have very distinguished contributors who have very distinctive academic achievements. In the interest of time, I'll just only read out their current affiliations, basically. So Professor Romila Thapar, the chair, she's a eminent historian and a professor emerita JNU. Professor Upinder Singh, currently affiliated to Ashoka University, the Department of History. Professor Kathleen Morrison, who's currently affiliated to Department of Anthropology, University of Pennsylvania. Professor Mozammel Hoque from the Archaeology Department, Jahangirnagar University, where we had commissioned this book. Dr. Bisnupriya Basak, Department of Archaeology, University of Calcutta. I welcome you all to today's event, and thank you for taking time out to be a part of this evening. Thank you very much. And on that note, I'd like to invite Professor Thapar to take charge of the proceedings and chair the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I have no intention of taking charge, but I will certainly do what I can to assist. Let me say at the outset that it's a great privilege for me to be here this evening and to be present at this discussion of a book which I think is an extremely important book in the collection of history and archaeology pertaining to South Asia. As you know, the book is on the archaeology of early medieval and medieval South Asia, might have been better to have restricted it a little bit and said East Asia, East India, East South Asia, but it's all very complicated. The geography gets very much in the way, so we leave it at that. I'll only say a couple of things in the beginning, and then I'll end up with a couple more at the end. But I'm greatly looking forward to the discussion of this book by this galaxy of scholars that have been collected. The essays of the book cover the time period of the early medieval and medieval history from the 6th to the 18th centuries. It's a long stretch of time, what Braudel would certainly have called a longue durée. But one can assume that it registers many changes and also registers a certain degree of evolution of forms and ideas. And I always find that this interface, as it were, of changes and evolutions are really quite fascinating when it comes to looking at history. And these are, of course, very carefully discussed in each of the chapters. The first part refers to the archaeological and historical remains of South Asia. There's a kind of study that is being undertaken in different regions of South Asia. It's not a general approach, thank goodness. It is a very specific study of each region, and that's extremely valuable. The area that is focused on is, of course, the Eastern Ganga-Brahmaputra Basin, and it's very much the eastern area of the subcontinent, which surprisingly, I must confess that I didn't think there would be too much deviation and change in this region, but I'm very impressed by reading the amount of change that actually does happen from one sub-region to another. What is called the second part of the book investigates a number of settlements through a range of data from varying sources. And this is one of the interesting aspects of this, that the sources are really quite diverse. And therefore bring in a number of new perspectives on the past of this particular area. The third part examines the typology of what has been found and the artifacts, not only from the region under discussion, but also happily in greater detail from what one might call the sub-regions, so that one really does get a very... Sorry, there's a voice intervening. The typology and the artifacts do, in fact, because they are discussed in greater detail, provide patterns that sometimes strike one as being possible patterns for comparison. And then the last part, which of course includes much more of the historical artifacts, temples, icons, coins, and such like, which means the sources expand. And one of the very fascinating aspects of these various essays is the way in which one gets an idea of how extensive, not only in number and so on, of the sources are, but how extensive they are in form and in the function that they perform. And so, seen as an entity, what we get is two things. One is a very good introduction to the combined interface of archaeology and history at very close quarters, which doesn't always happen with many books, but still it's there. And secondly, it gives a very intensive understanding of this particular region. So I'm delighted to say that we should now go ahead with the presentation of the papers. And may I ask the first paper presenter, Professor Upinder Singh from Ashoka University, I almost said Delhi University, Ashoka University, to present her thoughts. You must unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Of course.
Yeah.
One forgets these things. Thank you very much, Professor Thapar. I would like to start by congratulating Swadhin Sen and Surpriya Varma on bringing out this important book. I feel very sad that the third editor, my friend Bhairabi Prasad Sahu, is no longer with us. I would also like to congratulate all the contributors to this book. It is fitting that this book is dedicated to B.D. Chattopadhyaya, who, along with Herman Kulka, did so much to change the way that we think about the early medieval. Nowadays, we take it for granted, but I remember that when I was working on my PhD thesis on the inscriptions of Orissa in the late 1980s, I was deeply dissatisfied with the feudalism hypothesis, but I did not know what sort of framework to use to understand what my inscriptions were telling me. Chattopadhyaya and Kulka's writings appeared like a light at the end of a long tunnel. And yet, so strong was the grip of the feudalism school in Indian academia that even those scholars who were convinced by the Chattopadhyaya-Kulka integrative or processual models referred to it apologetically as the alternative model and the feudalism model as the dominant paradigm. I also had to struggle with the early medieval while teaching an undergraduate Delhi University course on it. The problem was that the history of the period seemed to have become a history of the feudalism debate, not about what was happening on the ground. My edited volume, Rethinking Early Medieval India, in fact emerged from this dissatisfaction. I argued there that over half a century of debate over whether early medieval India or South Asia was feudal or not had led to several important insights, but also several casualties. By this time, I could also recognize a certain paradox. Although the feudalism hypothesis had misunderstood, in my view, the rationale of royal land grants, certain aspects of the hypothesis were in fact acceptable, namely the description of political hierarchies and the emphasis on changes in agrarian relations. On the other hand, while the integrative model had got the issue of the rationale of the land grants right, it did not dwell sufficiently on agrarian relations. Also, its emphasis on integration de-emphasized conflict and violence. I concluded by saying that it was time to move beyond the debate and to rethink the ways in which we think about the early medieval. Well, this book shows that important progress has been made in these respects during the past decade or two. Due to the abundance of land grant charters, the field of early medieval South Asian history has been long dominated by epigraphic sources. I think that historians would have agreed that archaeological data was important, but historical archaeology was tilted towards the early historic. For the early medieval, there was little archaeological data available, and hence archaeology was underused. When it was cited, as in the theory of urban decay, it carried little weight because of its meagerness and patchiness. This book fills an important gap. It shows how important an archaeological perspective is to understand this period, and it demonstrates this in concrete terms. The book's long time frame from the 6th to the 18th centuries is useful for tracking down patterns of cultural continuity and change. The focus on the eastern part of the Bhagirathi Hooghly and a segment of the catchment of the Brahmaputra Meghna rivers also brings in a dimension that is generally neglected. This is the constant play between land and water and the impact of this on settlement history. I think that the editor's introduction raises many pertinent points. These include the relationship between archaeology and history. There is the problem of the use of dynastic labels in archaeology. There is the issue of periodization and the possibility of looking at different periodizations for different regions. There's the problem of identifying the material markers of urbanity in the archaeological record and of how to interpret changes in ceramic traditions. The disconnect between studies of visual sources and archaeological context is also raised. The book calls for questioning, dialogue, and arguments among scholars belonging to different fields, and this is very welcome. Labels are useful for the sake of convenience, and we should not spend too much time arguing over them. But they should have some clear logic and consistency, and they can also lead to problems in interpretation. Surpriya Varma's chapter ends with a discussion of the site of Indore Khera and also Rohana Khurd, but includes much more. I agree with her that there is a problem with the term early medieval. If we talk of the early historic, then where is the late or later historic? If we talk about the early medieval, which is the late medieval? And how can we jump directly from the early historic to the early medieval? Further, the term early medieval means something different when we approach it from the direction of ancient South Asia and Sanskrit epigraphic sources, and something different when we approach it from the direction of Persian sources and the Delhi Sultanate. Supriya perceptively draws attention to the reasons for the big gap in the volume of historical and archaeological work for the period, and for the invisibility of archaeology. This includes the institutional relationship between history and archaeologies in universities and old-fashioned methods used in South Asian archaeology. The errors in assigning dates to archaeological layers on the basis of certain artifact types or coins, for instance at Lalkot, are especially loud alarm bells that we should heed. The ways in which sites are labeled, for instance according to religious categories, can form a major hindrance to how they are investigated and understood. This is really especially the problem with sites that have been, for instance, routinely labeled as Buddhist sites. I faced that problem in my study of Nagarjun Konda, which has Buddhist remains and Buddhist layers, but there's so much more to the site than that. I'm glad that Supriya's discussion of site studies that mark a break from traditional approaches includes Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka, because we often forget the importance of that island. I think that the swift books and sites that are being excavated on the basis of state-of-the-art archaeological methods will play an important role in the course correction that is clearly required. Bhairabi Sahu has an excellent account of changing perspectives on the early medieval, focusing on the work done by archaeologists and historians and highlighting some important studies. As someone who has worked on early medieval inscriptions, I am aware that the usual, often inconclusive attempts to identify donated villages on the basis of phonetic similarities in place names is far from satisfactory. Archaeological surveys of sites where the inscriptions have been found can help us better understand the nitty-gritty of the ground realities and contexts of land grants. In his characteristically balanced way, Bhairabi points out that archaeology and history need not compete with each other. They can gain from each other and complement each other. As far as the general issues are concerned, Swadhin Sen, S.M. Kamrul Ahsan, Abir bin Kaisar, and Ahmed Sharif give a critique of the treatment of the by scholars based in Bangladesh. We see some similarities, but also several differences in the frames of reference with Indian scholars. I think this calls for a larger discussion on how ideas of the nation have made an impact on archaeology and history across the countries of South Asia. The thick detail in the study of sites in northwestern Bengal, the categories of sites, the tabulation of data is very impressive. This includes the dovetailing and mapping of data from epigraphy and archaeology. The material elements visible in the archaeological record, for instance, iron slag, religious structures, and patterns of reuse, add important dimensions to our understanding of grassroots realities of human experience. I think that the discussion of the archaeology of water in a continuously changing alluvial landscape is an especially important intervention. This also comes out in the chapters by A.K.M. Saifur Rahman and Afroza Khan Mita, and the one by Swadhin Sen and A.K.M. Khurshid Alam. I especially liked the phrase entangled impermanence used to express the land-water relationship in the latter chapter. The contributions by Colleen Lafranc and Preeti Sharma are important because they deal with that staple of historical archaeology, pottery. Lafranc's technomorphological study of pottery from Hastangarh, Balupur, and Jagjivanpur shows some similarities, but also a great deal of variety. Preeti Sharma's comparative analysis of pottery from 6 sites in the Brahmaputra Valley from the 7th to the 15th centuries looks especially at macro and micro levels and at the degree of variability in form, technology, and ornamentation. These studies alert historians against making simplistic correlations between ceramic traditions and groups of people. I think that ethnoarchaeological studies can help us understand ceramic traditions better. One of the many merits of this book is that while it emphasizes archaeology, it also pays due attention to other sources. Ryosuke Furui's study of agrarian developments in early medieval North Bengal represents the kind of intensive, detailed analysis of the epigraphic data, attentive to the nuances of the technical vocabulary, which is needed to reconstruct the details of developments in the agrarian sphere. It also helps show the connections between the continuities and changes in this sphere and what was happening at the political level. Claudine Baudse-Picron's study of images of divinities from Eastern India in their spatial context, including in manuscripts, throws light on the Hindu-Buddhist interface. Sharmila Saha's study of temple building in Western Bengal looks at temples within their larger archaeological contexts, something that is very much required. Sutapa Sinha's discussion of the monetary history of Bengal sees the 13th century as marking a point of significant change. It alerts us to the fact that critiquing communal interpretations of history should not mean disregarding the impact of political changes, including in expressions of political ideology. I think that what makes this book especially useful is that it moves beyond critique to adding substance to our understanding of early medieval South Asia. It shows that over the past couple of decades, there has in fact been significant progress in filling out the archaeological profiles of several sites. The book also shows that the way forward lies in a frank and fruitful dialogue between archaeology, history, epigraphy, numismatics, and art history. I'm especially happy that while presenting a synthesis of several important studies on this region, the book has broken several boundaries, especially between scholars from India and Bangladesh. I hope that we will have more such border-crossing collaborative ventures between historians and archaeologists belonging to the various countries of South Asia. Thank you very much. I learned a great deal from this book, and I congratulate once again the editors and the contributors.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Upinder Singh, for that extremely useful understanding of what the book represents. May I now ask Professor Kathleen Morrison to make her comments?
Yes, thank you very much. And, again, like everyone else, I just want to congratulate the editors and all of the authors for this very important book. Professor Thapar started out by suggesting that this book comes from a somewhat marginalized region in terms of the history writing and history making, that of undivided Bengal. And so my perspective, as you might guess, comes from another somewhat marginalized region in South Asia, from the south, where I spent many decades studying a site that was said to be late medieval, but now apparently is early modern, right? Which gives us some sense of the challenges of this kind of periodization. More recently, I started a project at the iconic site of Brahmagiri in Chitradurg district in Karnataka that was famously excavated by Mortimer Wheeler in 1947, rather a pivotal year in the history of South Asia. One curious thing about Wheeler's work at Brahmagiri is, as is well known, he identified a sequence of what we would now call the Southern Neolithic Early Historic, Southern Neolithic Iron Age Early Historic. But Wheeler ignored, seemingly, an entire early medieval city, Hanea, that is right on top of and on the same hill as Brahmagiri, right? So that already tells you something. And so because of this, really, I've been thinking about the significance of colonial legacies in the archaeology and history of South Asia. And so I just want to kind of focus on that, and particularly some important points raised by the authors and the editors of the book, right? So in the introduction, the editors talk about the colonial legacy of archaeology in South Asia as a subdiscipline, or as being part of history rather than some other discipline, either a standalone discipline or, you know, an odd location like anthropology as it is in the US. And not only that, the fact that archaeology, especially in these, you know, historic time periods, is often really a kind of handmade into history, right? That is really used only to sort of prop up the findings or of text-based history, right? And what we see in terms of frameworks then that emerge out of this kind of historical relationship is that the dynastic and religious histories really dominate. When we talk about historical periods from the medieval onward, we typically refer to them in dynastic terms, right? And religious periodization, as Upinder also pointed out, has its own challenges, right? So the ubiquitous ancient, medieval, modern classification that we face in South Asia is itself not much better, really, than the colonial religiously based three-part division that it replaced, right? The term medieval, though, which at least in South India, there was a bit of an effort. I'm not sure it took to replace it with the term middle period, but middle just means medieval, just means middle, so that's not really, you know, a big improvement. What I wonder is, first of all, why we're using these terms at all. I mean, maybe we should have our own entirely separate thing. But more importantly, I think that we see that, you know, dynasties, for example, don't necessarily map onto changes we see archaeologically, a point made very well and very clearly in this book, right? So the curious persistence of religious and dynastic history, especially in terms of the categories and classifications that we use, is interesting when you think about the decades of economic history that have been developed in South Asia, and yet those have had virtually no impact, you know, despite the history that Upinder just talked about in terms of the feudalism hypothesis and so on. Those have had virtually no impact on the kind of labels and classifications that we use for periods, right? So the issues of periodization and classification, I think, although they seem dull and boring in many ways, they're absolutely foundational to how we think about these periods. So despite a lot of economic history, that work has not necessarily changed the labels that we use. And of course, there's virtually no environmental history at all involved in this as well. And that's unfortunate because the data of archaeology are generally much more amenable to economic and environmental kind of history than dynastic history in general. So the book raises the broader problem of periodization, right? As well as the categories themselves. And the editors point out that, you know, pan-South Asian categories are, or even pan-Indian or pan-regional categories are deeply problematic, right? And this is certainly true looking at this from down in the peninsular India, right? But it's probably worth pointing out that this difficulty of correlating periodizations, like what is the early medieval in this region versus, you know, the Gangetic Plain versus the peninsula, it doesn't, you know, it's not coincident at all. This is also true for prehistoric periodization, right? So this is not a problem unique to the medieval, right? So the Neolithic, for example, is by no means the same thing in different parts of South Asia, which really makes you wonder why we're doing it at all. All right, so the first sort of colonial legacy then is the use of the subsuming archaeology under history and the kind of dominance, you might say, of dynastic and religious categories and classifications, notwithstanding, a lot of interest and effort in other topics like economic history. Okay. And the problems of correlating periods across large areas. The second aspect that the editors raise is really a kind of issue that emerges when archaeology becomes a subfield of history. And I think that they rightly point to the minimal attention that has been often paid to the methodological and epistemic issues of archaeology itself. Right? So the kind of source side criticism that we see applied to text-based history is generally not extended, that courtesy, let's say, is not extended to archaeological data as well, which have its own kinds of, challenges. Instead, we often see, as they point out, a kind of simple object correlation, right? A kind of association between some particular type of ceramic, an architectural form, or a sculpture that's meant to index the periods that are established historically, right? So this use of what used to be called an index fossil, or even more kind of old-fashioned, the fossil director, is the search for one particular kind of feature. Used to be in Paleolithic archaeology, like a type of hand axe or something, that really is not seen as important in itself, but it's a marker, and it stands in for something else. So if you find northern black polished ware, for example, or a particular temple style, that is merely an index or a reflection to the historical period, right? And this use of archaeology as a kind of more of a mine for objects and a mine for stratigraphically located objects is, of course, connected to the dominance of the Wheeler approach to excavation, right? And that is a focus on the vertical, on periodization and time depth, as the authors point out, and not on the horizontal, not on connections or relationships, right? So we often treat archaeological sites in South Asia as pottery mines, rather than as remnants of or sort of outcomes of past human action. So the fact that the Wheeler approach focuses on the vertical and on stratigraphy is honestly rather ironic, in the sense that also very large areas are usually opened for excavation. So the horizontal excavation that we tried to do at the site of Karibakale is a significantly smaller area than some of the vertical excavations carried out. So it's not as though we need to do things radically differently in terms of the scale of excavation, but matter of recording and looking at the material differently. The editors also point out very importantly that things like renovation, reuse, abandonment, and the very changing contexts of sites and monuments is often ignored, right? That sites, monuments, sculptures are seen as belonging to a particular time period, as a period, say, of their construction, and not thinking about the way in which they continue to be salient in later time periods. So this approach, of course, gives us very flat histories, right? Where every layer or period is kept entirely separate. And it's only we, the scholar, the archaeologist, who is allowed to interact with past objects. Whereas we know, of course, that if we see temples and artifacts, objects on the landscape, they're here in the present right now, or archaeology would not be possible. And we know that people in the past were also very interested in temples, artifacts, sculptures, and so on. So there's a kind of interconnection or imbrication between these layers or these periods, which the methods that we use make it very difficult to see. So in general, then, I would just point out, an important contribution of the book and the challenge that it takes up very boldly to better integrate archaeology and history. And that is, I think in South Asia, we are not harnessing the full potential of archaeological research, right? By treating archaeology in some simplistic ways, we are not doing ourselves a service, and we could certainly do better. The book, as Upinder also pointed out, calls for debate and dialogue. And I think that is also, in addition to the very real substantive contributions of all of the fine papers, a very welcome approach. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. And once again, congratulations and thank you for the opportunity to make some comments.
Thank you very much indeed for that presentation. May I now ask Dr. Mozammel Hoque to make her presentation, or his presentation? His presentation. Sorry. Can't hear. Could you unmute yourself? We can't hear.
Good evening. I must congratulate Swadhin Sen, Surpriya Varma, and Bhairabi Prasad Sahu for this book, because this is I found this is an interesting work, and all the articles are very important not for now and for future. I'm happy that they have given more emphasis on Bengal Delta, because Bengal Delta has been ignored till a couple of years before also, that nobody was giving importance on these archaeological sites. And this early medieval culture is very rich in Bengal, especially west of Bhagirathi and Brahmaputra Valley. And the articles what Dr. Swadhin Sen and his team has written, and I know that Dr. Swadhin Sen, last 20 to 25 years, he has been working on early medieval site, especially in North Bengal. And in recent days, he has given emphasis to South Bengal also, a few sites he has interpreted. I have seen his article. And it is a contributory work. A contributory work in the second step. Contributory work for North Bengal, because in two articles, what he has shown that how rivers, especially Tista rivers, is changing, gradually changing the landscape, created a new rivers, and the change with the changing phenomena of landscape, the settlement starts, and human activities, social activities, economic activities started. That he has shown that gradual development took place in North Bengal, especially in the Tista floodplain. A number of sites he has considered, and he has zoning those sites like Zone 1, Zone 2 up to Zone 6, and he calculated all the sites in the zones, and he has given a different characteristics from one zone to another zone, and one interrelation between one zone to another zone. This article will, this paper will help for future scholars, especially historian and archaeologists, to work on it and to give emphasis on the Bengal history. His another paper, which Swadhin Sen and his team has written, engaging with the past beyond the comfort zone, early medieval and medieval in the archaeological context of the northwestern part of Bengal. In that paper, he has categorized all the sites into 7 forms, like wallet settlement, then archaeological places enclosed by moats, the type of settlements he has explained, and he has documented those sites, and that will help to understand the nature of early medieval sites of our country. And as you know, that only 10 to 15% scholars, both archaeologists and historians, they are still using the early medieval term, and rest of the people in our country, they are considering these are ancient period. So that is why it is a brave attempt by Swadhin Sen to change change our historical method and research method in our country, especially in Bangladesh. Though it has been regularly practiced in India, but in Bangladesh it is a different things, because archaeological research is still poor in our country. And another article is more interesting, and which we didn't know through this book only. We came to know from South Bengal. This is written by Saifur Rahman and Afshuza Khan Mita, and we knew only 1 or 2 sites like Bharat Barna. It was a popular site in our country, but they brought up several ancient, medieval, and though the term it is medieval, but it is post-medieval. I agree with Upinder Singh that she has raised an issue that if there is early history, what is late history? If there is early medieval, what is late medieval? So late medieval, previously we know that immediate end of Mughal period onwards, it is a late medieval. We used to call an historical context in Bangladesh before the British came in our in South Asia. But in these articles, I found that there are late medieval sites which are considered as a medieval. So that between this terminology, there are a lot of confusion and conflict are there, and we need to discuss in future among the archaeologists and historians, because if early medieval, within the early medieval period, there are 2 types, two characteristics features you will find in the archaeological relics. For example, from 6th century to 9th century, this is that during this period, the architectural remains, sculptural remains, portrait type, coins, epigraph is one pattern. And from 10th century onwards, the architectural remains and other antiquity is different type. So we need to make a segment within the early medieval period. Similarly, from 1350 onwards to up to 1550 or 1600, one type of cultural pattern we'll find within the medieval period. After 1650, in Bengal, the architectural remains, political activities, economic pattern, sociological pattern, land use is a different type. So we need to make a different group for that. So that is why still there is a lot of debate. Anyway, this book will enrich us to how to deal with the early medieval sites and medieval sites, and a lot of information, new informations are there, which will help to rewrite our Bengal history in a different way. The scholars who dealt with these topics, they considered historical records, epigraphical records, then architecture, sculpture, coin, and enrich our thought and we need to work on it in future. But the book is very fantastic, and it will help us in near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I hope the scholars whom you are addressing will take note of what you said and will in fact follow your advice and look at the subject with the attitude that you are suggesting should now happen. We come to the last speaker today, Bisnupriya, and
yeah. Yeah, this is Bisnupriya.
Oh, Bisnupriya, sorry,
Yeah.
I was wrongly informed.
No, right. Thank you. Thank you very much, madam. It's a real pleasure to be present as a panelist today. I see so many of my friends, Hoque, Swadhin, and of course, my colleagues, Upinder and Surpriya, of course. Upinder and Professor Morrison, you have very nicely charted out the main, the conceptual and theoretical aspects of the book and the highlights. What are the most important contributions of the book? What I would like to do is, I've been working in the Bengal part of the West Bengal part of the Sundarbans for the last 6 years on issues slightly different. Looking at, in fact, my sectional president address in the Chennai session of the IHC was on that. That is trying to relocate archaeology, the interface of local history and quote unquote folk culture, kind of a cultural historiography of the Sundarbans. So what Professor Morrison was saying about that this book will definitely generate a lot of dialogue and debates. Definitely one is periodization. I'll be coming to that later. What is very important, which is stated in the book and which Professor Morrison was pointing out, that is how in the historiography, colonial as well as post-colonial historiography, how archaeology has been treated. That in most cases it is subsumed within history. Now, I have been looking at a lot of these vernacular texts, particularly pertaining to these are actually very, very fluid categories, local history or archaeology. There's a lot of ambivalence in how the disciplinary territory, the territorial boundaries, in fact, there are none if you look at some of these writings. So it's very interesting how people are scholars, whom we call amateur within quotes, how they are looking at the past. And several questions are coming up, whether the archaeological past and the historical past, whether they can be conflated, whether there are multiple pasts in the present, there are, and what really does it mean about a scientific study, quote unquote, of the past. Now, as Swadhin's paper, particularly, I think I had a chance to read this before it went to the press. I will point out this, that so when we are looking at the interrelationships, archaeology is at the interface of many of these disciplines, not just history, but also the social sciences and what we call, quote unquote, folk. That itself is a very debatable term. Now, Swadhin's and yes, I definitely would like to congratulate the editors and the contributors for, it's such, I would say, perhaps it is one of the most important work that has come out in Indian archaeology. I can't remember any such volume, to my very limited knowledge. I can't think of any other volume which is, breaking disciplinary boundaries. Now, one thing in connection to that, when I'm talking about historiography, let me point out something that is brought about by Swadhin's paper, and he has done a lot of work on that. And in fact, I was expecting if he could have accommodated such a paper in this volume. That is when he's talking about the thesis of Islamization. And there he is questioning certain stated theories of Islamization in South Bengal, in in the Sundarbans, in the Deltic Bengal. And very important point he's making, where he's critiquing monuments being seen as identity markers of the medieval. Very important point. Let me just point. Yes, when he's talking about the various mosques and mazars and the sacred placemaking in this area, in the area that he's dealing with, and the role of the Sufis that you're talking about, that you can see this within a polytheistic and monotheistic order. So Islamization is something which has to be problematized. That is what he is very emphatically saying, and that it's the various Sufi saints and the placemaking connected with the Sufi saints, the various myths and legends, how that actually contributes to placemaking. I think that is a very, very important point, and I felt that there should have been a chapter on this, which is you are actually trying to understand archaeology, not only in terms of monuments, but also in terms of certain places in the landscape and how they are mnemonics in the landscape. I think, and Swadhin has worked a lot on that, on the vernacular traditions, the texts, the legends and the myths. So coming back to from the point that I took off, that this, their central thesis, the central argument of this book, that the established thing of periodization has to be debunked. I think that could have been fleshed out even more, of course, because this book is so great that it has stimulated us. And as I was reading it over the past 3-4 days, I kept thinking that it could have been, certain things could have been fleshed out more. And then a very important thing about survey, which I would like to point out. The method. The methodology of survey. Now here, she is working in South Bengal, and the landscape is somewhat similar to the region that I have been working on. Different issues, but definitely I traverse that landscape. And there you have the problem about buried sites, like Chandraketu Gor, that is a buried site. And there are such scattered and fragmentary remains in Chandraketu Gor is in North 24 Parganas, and in the South 24 Parganas, sites are hardly preserved. In fact, it's even, the scene is, the scenario is even more, I mean, you do not know, how do you understand, how do you define an archaeological site and a landscape? So here one has to, and that would also be my question to the contributors and editors, that where most sites are buried, where, and even when you are carrying out deep core analysis, etc., with the help of geologists, but what you are getting is all fragments. So that kind of a landscape, that becomes very challenging to devise a methodology. They have been able to take up this challenge in Afroza Khan, Mitav, and Saifur Rahman, where they have been working. I think the challenge is, I think we have to think more in terms of that is a very good case study. We have to think more in terms of a methodology, talking about site formation processes, because as I was saying, how we define an archaeological site, most are find spots, that itself is a problem. So this is really, the more I'm talking and discussing with you, and such an engaging discussion it has been, and listening to all of you, I do think that, yes, we can have another session again for this. Some more things I won't take much time. I would like to point out some more details about the things about survey methodology and artifact analysis that Swadhin has, the editors and the contributors have pointed out. And there, one thing about artifact analysis, in one, I'm just reading out from Swadhin's reading out from Swadhin's, I think, from the introduction, that that how, so how typological dates are taken for granted as the dates of the layers from which specific types are recovered. Little attention is paid to other types of material culture from the same layer. Absolutely, I fully agree with you. But then, we do see that some of the chapters are talking about some of these diagnostic wares, like the Chinese wares has been mentioned, and also assigning the accepted chronology to the context from where these Chinese wares have been recovered or retrieved. So my question to the editors and the contributors would be, can we always do away with this? That is, when you're having a particular ware, a diagnostic ware, and when you're actually dating a particular layer on the basis of that, yes, it is very important to look at all ceramic assemblages, and this has been followed in some of the chapters, but can you always do away with such labeling? And I think it is mentioned in one of the chapters on how Chinese wares are looked at and how a kind of typology has been looked at and dated. Another thing I would just, Collins, I could see her there. I am familiar with her work. This is a very important analysis, the chain operator analysis, the way assemblage, which is really that, how it is challenging the existing typologies of ceramic assemblages. This is absolutely excellent. I only wish Colin could have referred more to the implications of such analysis and how it kind of enriches and complements the periodization thesis that has been raised in this paper. I will not take any more time. I think I'm getting a little carried away because this has been such an inspiring read. There's two things about Shormila Shaha's paper and Chhattapa Sinha's paper, excellent works. But I was a little troubled by one thing, that is the categories which have been questioned and which we fully agree with in the introduction. Somehow those categories have been maintained in these chapters. So what does that mean? Does it mean that we cannot question these categories or these periodizations always? Like Chhattapa Sinha is mentioning quite clearly that she thinks there is a definite break between the early medieval and the medieval. So these are some of the things which I found troubling, but all in all, it was a wonderful experience reading this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed for those remarks. You mentioned in passing that it would be nice to have another meeting to discuss some of these issues. Go ahead and organize such a meeting. I think it would be great. It's left to me, I believe, to sum up. Is that so? To conclude? I'm not quite clear as to the procedure for this evening. Do we conclude now?
I
Can't
think
hear.
Dr. Swadhin Sen would be doing a vote of thanks also. He will conclude.
Yeah, you can conclude and summarize and talk
Right,
about your opinion,
right.
and then I will take just 2 minutes as to express my thanks to everyone.
Right at the end after
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
Okay, fine. So let me first of all say that I feel I should gather up all these many congratulations, put them in a bouquet, and then hand them over to you, Swadhin, and your colleagues who brought this book together. It really has been a very impressive achievement. And let's hope that you won't just sit on these laurels and you will go ahead and produce perhaps another book with some of these questions have been raised. I am not daring to say anything about this debate about archaeology and history because I'm completely out of touch, but I will just make a few general remarks from a jaded historian, and you will know perhaps what some of these ideas that came to me might have some meaning. In the old days, a century ago, of course, archaeology was what provided evidence of human remains, human activity, human settlements, and that kind of thing, which was slowly and gradually worked into some kind of an order, into some kind of a description. Today, of course, this is out, and what we are what we are talking about, in fact, are the concepts that are important. And I think that maybe what we need to do is to define the concepts much more clearly than we have done, not move from the evidence to the concepts in every case, but define the concepts and then try it out and see whether the concept and the evidence fit together. I mean, I think the departure in archaeology and the interest in territory and landscape are extremely significant because they bring in a totally different dimension, which is very, very necessary to archaeological thinking. It brings in the ecology, it brings in the environment, the relationship of land to water, which we really have given absolutely minimal attention to as historians, but which is foundationally important to the establishing of sites and work of that kind. And if we are to work on these concepts, then the archaeology of settlements has to be meticulously worked out and meticulously defined in order to provide the evidence that is required. There are, of course, still many typologies. I mean, the great thing about archaeology, one felt from the time that one as a student studied it, was the excitement of typologies, of finding new ways, new descriptions, new definitions of what was going on. Pastoral communities, and then you start looking at herders and you start looking at the animals they herded, animal bones, what were they used for? This gives you a different kind of dimension to what the term pastoral community means. The remains of peasant cultures, for example, can be traced to the cultivation of crops, as everybody has been doing, and containers, but one is interested in other aspects. Like I've always been very struck by the fact that when we look at the Red Sea trade between India and the Eastern Mediterranean, and you have these large numbers of amphorae sherds that come up. And it's very exciting because there are experts in wine who look at the amphorae sherds and tell you exactly where the wine came from the Mediterranean and from Europe and so on. What it really triggers up then is this whole idea of, there you have in the Tamil sources, people writing hymns saying, the wine that the Yavanas bring is extraordinarily good. And then you begin to think, what were the occasions when they drank this wine? How did they use it? What did the wine mean to them? How did it relate to other things that they drank locally? And how did they project their ideas of what these Yavana traders were doing with the amphorae of wine that they were bringing in? It's a kind of world that I think we tend to push aside because we're so concerned with just material culture. But I think it would be very exciting to bring in some of the thoughtfulness that goes into the making of this material culture. And the other exciting thing, of course, is that it's true that archaeology, like history, has been very land-based, but we're now entering the era of water-based thinking, maritime archaeology, maritime sites, maritime places that people go to. And how does this, in fact, affect both archaeology and history in terms of the evidence, in terms of the concepts that we have been using for a long, long time? There was a time when archaeology was treated as confirming the texts, and this is why you had the basic training for Indian archaeologists was in the study of Sanskrit, because you would have to look at an object and say, yes, it has an equivalent in the text, and it's called this. What do the texts say about it? How is it described? And you give a life to that object. But at the same time, of course, the object has its own life, which doesn't necessarily get conditioned by what you say that the texts use to describe it. And this brings in the whole question of how have historians looked at the evidence from archaeology? Are there other ways of doing it? Are there very different ways of doing it? We are all familiar with the fact that the evidence from archaeology produces many more typologies of culture and structure and so on. It's treated much more in terms of what are these typologies, how do they relate to each other, and so on. The difference between a village settlement and an urban settlement is very important. These are not issues that come into textual material. And if historians are dealing much more with textual material, it is only now that they're beginning to start asking the kinds of questions that will bring a lot of this evidence into a consideration. Land and water, for example, absolutely fundamentally important in terms of looking at any settlement or site and so on. What is the function of water? Do we have anybody talking about the function of water in different settlements in India and different cultures in India? Is it being used for irrigation? If it's being used for irrigation, how does it change from Persian wheels to reservoirs to canals? Is it being used in towns for drainage, for drinking, and so on? What is the evidence for that? Then there are also questions of size, which have to do with not just an idea that one has that these should be large and should be small, but it has to do with economic resources. It has to do with hinterlands, and it has to do with borders, connected or unconnected. So the very excavation of a settlement is really just the beginning of a whole range of questions. And I think that we as historians and archaeologists should perhaps open ourselves much more to this range of questions and not be inhibited by thinking, oh, but these are silly questions. They're really not silly questions. They can be very meaningful questions. The evidence from archaeology, the evidence from textual sources is very different, intrinsically different. Material culture is not the same as abstract thought. And I think that this has to always be kept in mind when one is talking about the evidence coming from two different sources, going to disciplines that are up to a point related, but up to a point distinct. And that too is important. Mention was made of the Sufis and some of the places of worship. And yes, these are places that have religious importance. But by using the term a place of religious importance, one is also imputing, the historian should be imputing, that it is a place of many other kinds of importance as well. Very often, if they're monuments or places of worship put up by people in authority or people in power, these are statements of power. These are statements of authority. What is the kind of power and what is the kind of authority that they're talking about, which, in a sense, is sharpened by the existence of material culture, by the existence of a monument or the objects that are used in rituals and so on, but nevertheless is something that has to be discussed in much greater detail. And then this lovely knotty question of periodization, which we've all been banging our heads over for decades now. I remember the earliest conferences that I went to as a student in the School of Oriental African Studies in London. Frequently, the question of periodization would come up. But of course, then everybody was under the very strong imprint of colonial teaching. So we had Hindu, Muslim, and British. And then slowly we edged out of that and we had ancient, medieval, and modern. Now we've edged out of that. We seem to be following the European model again when we talk about ancient and early medieval and early modern and modern. These are all being imported in. We must, we must remember that periodization has a dual role. It can pull people together, it can pull events together, it can pull cultures together, it can push them apart and make them quite distinct. And so one has to ask the question, what is the periodization based on, and what is the purpose of the periodization? Historical periodization is based on large amounts of time. It's obsessed with chronology, and it is defined very often by categories that are constructed on time, like dynasties and terms like ancient, medieval, modern, and the byproducts of these. Or sometimes it's something that has another kind of reckoning. Lineages and genealogies are other forms of periodization in a way, as are dynasties as well. Or changes in religion. One notices these changes, and that's a different kind of periodization. Archaeology is based much more on technological change and the effect of that technological change and what function does it have in society. Now, I'm not making an absolutely categorical statement that archaeology is technological change and history is simply a record of time. All I'm trying to suggest is that the kind of periodization that is used in these two disciplines is influenced by other factors than necessarily the ones that we always associate them with. Archaeology changes, periodizes the change when there is major technological change, when resources change, when the material culture changes. Does this coincide with the chronology and the chronological divides of history? Very often not. So what are we going to do when it comes to trying to correlate the periodization in the two disciplines? I think that it would be interesting if we slightly changed our attitude to periodization and treated it as the trigger for asking questions. Does it apply? Does it fit? What questions does it raise? There cannot be one marker to determine an entire period of activity. There have to be multiple markers. So do we perhaps move on and consider periodization as multiple kinds of periodization that coexist and come to us through different disciplines? Let me end on a note that I am slightly obsessed with these days. That is the notion of the region and the frontier. what do we study when we say regional history? I mean, this book is a very good demonstration of some of the issues that can be raised when one studies regional history. The focus on the region is direct and pointed and is helpful in recognizing the structure of the region. We are given the landscape of what is under study, what are the different areas that come under the same boundaries, and what are the frontiers of the region. These are frontiers of the region, and they are not identical on every side of the region. What makes them varied? The characteristics of what makes them varied need not be determined by the region itself. It may also be influenced by the areas outside the region, which the frontier is demarcating from the region under study. I mean, this is very interestingly discussed in this book. If one takes the frontiers of this region, the north is creeping into the sub-Himalayan region, the northern frontiers. It cuts across what in other areas is known as the Terai. It is not known as the Terai here necessarily, but it's a similar kind of ecology. To the east, there is a drop that comes straight down, and it's largely agricultural regions, cultivated regions. Sorry, to the east. And this kind of continues in a westward direction. And then suddenly in the south, you get coastal areas, totally different from the north. This is all one region, it's all being treated as one region. But this in itself suggests immense diversity. And I think that one of the things that we should be underlining is that what makes a region, it doesn't necessarily mean similarities and uniformities. It can be diversities. And that region is then created through the interface of the cultures of ecology and the environment meeting what we call the cultures of society and the others, the general definition of culture that we all have used. Another difference, I think, which needs to be kept in account is the cultural distance that sometimes exists between the core of the region and the frontier, the boundaries. I am very struck by how the notion of boundary changes in history. If one thinks of boundaries in the pre-modern period, one thinks of physical features very often, mountains, rivers, deserts, a different environment or a demarcated environment which marks the region, the central region from the frontier region. And my pet statement is that what created the boundary was cartography. It was when you get maps being made that you have this fine red line being drawn, and this is called the boundary. Now, is that an ecological boundary? Is it an environmental boundary? Is it a geographical boundary? Is it a cultural boundary? Is it a political boundary? There are multiple ways of defining boundaries, and I think that these multiple ways need to be studied. We have to keep in mind that the frontiers of a region are not identical. They're very different very often, as in this case. And we have to keep in mind that they would then follow different cultural patterns as well. So let's not be surprised when we are studying a region and different patterns show up. This is something that we should accept. But I think one of our problems is that we are a little too dependent when we describe a region on maps. and descriptions, which is where I think archaeology becomes extremely crucial, because archaeology is telling you, no, this is what you find, and this is what defines a region. And this is where the historian has to accept the information that is provided by archaeology. The boundary then is both an area which brings in people, it's also an area which throws out people. It's playing a double function. And I think that this function needs to be looked at. The interface of cultures is much greater in the frontier regions than in the core regions, obviously. And these differences should perhaps be brought out a little more, both from archaeological data as well as from historical studies. The region as a unit also has another aspect to it, which is tracking migrations of people. And the definition of boundaries and frontiers is also tied into the coming in of migrations of groups of people. Migrations are of various kinds. There is no uniform migration. Some are seasonal with herding and with trading groups. The Arabian Sea, for example, if I go back again to my example of the Red Sea trade, the pepper could only be shipped at certain times of the year. Why? Because the shipping was going according to the winds of the monsoon. And so the coming in of goods and the going out of goods is conditioned by the winds of the monsoon until navigational technology changes. The permanent settlements, of course, are completely different. There are people coming in, settling down, and creating new mixed cultures. And this happens all the way down the west coast of India, across the Arabian Sea, when you first get the local people coming in called Yavanas, and when you get the Arabs coming in, who are also called Yavanas. It is seen as a continuity. But nevertheless, it is the intermixing of cultures, because new forms emerge all down the west coast of India. That's just one example I'm taking. The same thing happens elsewhere. What happens then? New questions are asked, new formulations are accepted, new ways of life are accepted. And therefore, this becomes a very interesting area in which history is trying to define a region. Archaeology is sending you evidence which may or may not agree altogether with these definitions. And at the end of the day, then you're left with historians and archaeologists looking at each other and saying, how do we define this region? And I think that's one of the most exciting things that's happening in history today, which is why, of course, one so eagerly reads a book that deals with this problem. I will stop there and leave it to Swadhin to say the final word.
It is really exciting and a great pleasure for me to listen to all these eminent scholars about our book. And as well as I am very happy and grateful to see many of our colleagues and many of the eminent scholars who are not directly related to this book are present also in this event. And I would like to thank definitely all the attendees. And I would like to mention just 2 points that I was talking to Dr. Kathy several times that one of the basic problems as archaeologists we are facing in Bangladesh, as well as in several parts of South Asia, for example, in northeastern part, probably also in some other parts which are not very exposed to intense research that access to data, that is one of the big hindrance of our research. We don't have much access to, for example, archival data, as well as we are in great difficulty of finding some kind of support to get radiometric dates. That is what me and I and Kathy was discussing, for example, in the context of Bengal or Bangladesh. So dates are very important. Radiometric dates are very important. And this book, in a sense, is a humble attempt to raise some questions and issues. I don't know whether in my lifetime we will be able to find all the answers. One of our gurus, he was a professor of Bisnupriya and a very good archaeologist, especially knowledgeable person of Bengal region, Dr. Arun Nag. He once told me by listening after my frustration that we have so many questions, but we have so little answers, and we have so little support from different types of disciplines and methods. Then he was telling me that, Swadhin, throughout my life, I have learned one thing, that you will not find answers to all of your problems, that you have to accept it. So this is very frustrating and depressing indeed, that we have, for example, right now, we have so many samples and so many datas in our disposal, but we don't have that kind of capacity or that kind of support to analyze all these datas. Like, for example, paleobotanical datas, for example, other kinds of datas, for example, datings, for example, radiocarbon dating or other kind of datings. So some of the questions can be really attended to, but at the same time, with the process of our work, new questions will come to our mind. And most importantly, our archaeological practice is basically a teamwork. So it is also very important to look at these practical aspects or process of doing archaeology when we work as a team, and which is not very easy always in our context. So again, I would like to specially thank Professor Romila Thapar for chairing this session and raising some very important, like she has done throughout her life, important and significant questions and points about this book, about the relationship between history and archaeology. And I would like to also express my humble gratitude to Professor Upinder Singh, Professor Kathleen Morrison, Dr. Bisnupriya Basak, and Professor Mozammel Hoque. And finally, I would like to remember again the people or the persons whom we have lost, Professor B.D. Chattopadhyaya, Professor Bhairabi Prasad Sahu, and one of our great mentors in Bangladesh, Professor Abdul Mumin Choudhury. And again, I would like to thank all the attendees and all the scholars, including Professor Richard Eaton, Professor Michael Steklers, and many others, and all the most of the contributors of this book is present in this event. I would like to thank them again for their support, and some of them are continuously helping us. For example, Dr. Roy Sukukurui, Professor Claudine Buzzo-Picro, they are always in our support. Whenever we ask some questions, they are happy to come forward with some answers or replies. So I would like to thank all of you for your patient hearing. And we will try our best to continue our research, continue our work, and try to find answers. And with this note of thanks, I would like to conclude this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Swadhin.